The sun was setting over the city skyline as a silver BMW cruised smoothly down Main Street. Behind the wheel sat a professional black woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a navy blue suit, her briefcase resting on the passenger seat beside her. She'd just wrapped up another successful day at her law firm, winning a major case for her client. The clock on her dashboard read 6:45 p.m., and she was looking forward to getting home to her husband. The evening traffic had thinned out, making it a peaceful drive home. She hummed along to her favorite jazz tune playing softly on the radio, her mind already drifting to the relaxing evening ahead. Maybe they'd order from that new Thai place her colleague had recommended, or perhaps they'd cook together, something they both enjoyed doing when their busy schedules allowed. That's when she noticed the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart sank a little, even though she knew she hadn't done anything wrong. She'd been driving exactly at the speed limit, her tags were up to date, and she'd just had her car serviced last week. Still, she knew the drill. She'd been here before, more times than she cared to count. Taking a deep breath, she carefully pulled over to the right side of the road, making sure to park well out of the traffic's way. She turned down her radio, rolled down her window, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. These weren't just random actions, they were survival skills she'd learned over the years. Through her side mirror, she watched the police officer approach. Something about his walk made her uneasy. It wasn't the usual professional stride she was accustomed to seeing. This officer was walking with what seemed like purpose, and not the good kind. The beam from his flashlight hit her side mirror, then her face, lingering there longer than necessary. She squinted against the harsh light but maintained her composure. The officer was white, middle-aged with a buzz cut and a face set in stone. His nameplate read Officer Sullivan. License and registration, he barked, not even bothering with the usual good evening that most officers would use to start the interaction. His tone was sharp, aggressive, almost like he was looking for a confrontation rather than conducting a routine traffic stop. She kept her voice steady and polite as she replied, "Of course, officer. My registration is in the glove compartment, and my license is in my purse on the back seat. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's okay." The officer's response was immediate and hostile. "Just hurry up, and don't try anything funny." She moved slowly, deliberately, narrating her actions as she'd learned to do. "I'm opening the glove compartment now. Here's the registration. Now I'm reaching for my purse in the back seat." But before she could complete her movement, Officer Sullivan's hand went to his hip, resting on his holster. "I said don't try anything funny," he shouted, his voice echoing in the quiet evening air. She froze, her heart pounding but her exterior remaining calm. Years of courtroom experience had taught her how to maintain composure under pressure. "Officer," she said carefully, "I'm simply reaching for my license as you requested. Would you prefer to retrieve my purse yourself?" His face twisted into something ugly. "Are you telling me how to do my job? Do you know how many of you people I deal with who think they know better than me?" The phrase "you people" hung in the air like poison. She'd heard it before, too many times to count, but it never stopped stinging. Still, she kept her voice level, professional. She was a lawyer after all. She knew her rights, and more importantly, she knew how crucial it was to document everything. "Officer Sullivan," she said, making sure to use his name, "I'm not telling you how to do anything. I'm simply trying to comply with your request for my license and registration. Could you please tell me why I was pulled over?" The officer's face reddened. "Step out of the vehicle. Now." As she reached for her door handle, she pressed the emergency button on her phone, a special feature her husband had insisted she install. It would send her live location to him immediately. Given his position at the FBI, they both knew the importance of having backup plans. Little did Officer Sullivan know, his night was about to take an unexpected turn. This ordinary traffic stop was seconds away from becoming anything but ordinary, and Officer Sullivan was about to learn a valuable lesson about profiling the wrong person. But more importantly, this incident would soon spark a chain of events that would impact not just one police officer, but an entire department's approach to racial bias and professional conduct. The evening air felt heavy as she stepped out of her car, her heels clicking softly against the asphalt. The sound of passing cars created a steady backdrop to this tense scene, their headlights occasionally illuminating Officer Sullivan's increasingly agitated face. She could feel her phone buzzing in her pocket, likely her husband responding to the emergency alert, but she didn't dare reach for it now. "Hands where I can see them," Officer Sullivan barked, his voice carrying an edge that made nearby pedestrians turn their heads. A small crowd was beginning to gather on the sidewalk, several people slowing their pace, some quietly pulling out their phones. She kept her hands visible, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the officer's growing hostility. "Officer, I'm still unclear about why I was pulled over. Could you please explain the violation?" Officer Sullivan stepped closer, his face twisted with barely contained anger. "Oh, so you're one of those educated types who thinks they know everything about the law." His breath was visible in the cool evening air as he spoke, his words coming out like steam from a pressure cooker about to blow. She stood her ground, her legal training kicking in. "Sir, I'm simply requesting information about the alleged violation. It's my right as a citizen to—" "Rights?" He cut her off, taking another step forward. "You want to talk about rights? How about my right to ensure public safety? Your taillight is out." She knew this wasn't true. She'd just had her car serviced last week, and she'd done her own walk-around inspection that morning, a habit she'd developed over years of dealing with situations exactly like this one. "Officer Sullivan," she replied calmly, "I respect your authority, but I checked my car this morning, and all lights were functioning properly. Would you mind if we verify this together?" This seemed to push him over the edge. "Are you calling me a liar?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the surrounding buildings. More phones came out from the growing crowd of onlookers. "Get your hands on the hood. Now." She noticed his body camera's indicator light was off, another red flag. As she carefully moved toward her car's hood, she spoke clearly for the benefit of the witnesses recording the scene. "Officer, I notice your body camera appears to be turned off. Would you please activate it for both our safety?" His reaction was immediate and explosive. "Don't you dare tell me how to do my job." His hand shot up suddenly, and for a terrifying moment, it looked like he was about to strike her. The crowd gasped collectively, several voices crying out in alarm. She didn't flinch. Years of courtroom experience had taught her the power of maintaining composure under pressure. Instead, she locked eyes with him, her gaze steady and unflinching. "Officer Sullivan, there are at least a dozen witnesses filming this interaction right now. I strongly suggest you consider your next action carefully." Time seemed to freeze. Officer Sullivan's hand remained raised, his face a battlefield of emotions, anger warring with the sudden realization that he'd let the situation spiral far beyond a simple traffic stop. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air. In that tense moment, two things happened simultaneously. A police cruiser pulled up behind Officer Sullivan's vehicle, its lights off, likely responding to calls from concerned witnesses. And from the other direction, a dark SUV approached swiftly but quietly, coming to a stop just within the scene's periphery. The crowd's attention shifted to the newcomers, phones still recording, as Officer Sullivan remained frozen in his threatening pose. He was so focused on the woman in front of him that he hadn't noticed the new arrivals, but she had, and the slight smile that crossed her face told everyone watching that the tables were about to turn. The door of the SUV opened silently, and a figure emerged, tall, professional, and carrying an authority that seemed to change the very atmosphere of the scene. Officer Sullivan still hadn't turned around, his hands still raised, but something in her expression finally made him realize he wasn't in control of this situation anymore. Behind him, purposeful footsteps approached, accompanied by the subtle but distinct sound of a badge chain jingling. The growing smile on her face told the gathering crowd that this confrontation was about to take a very different turn. Officer Sullivan was about to learn a valuable lesson about profiling the wrong person on the wrong night. But more than that, he was about to become an unwitting catalyst for change in a system that desperately needed it. As her husband approached from behind the officer, she knew this wouldn't just be another case of police harassment swept under the rug. This time, things would be different. The gathered crowd held their collective breath, phones still recording, as they waited to see what would happen next. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It had become a moment that would soon go viral, sparking conversations about police conduct and racial bias across the country. But first, Officer Sullivan needed to learn exactly who he had chosen to harass tonight. The tension in the air crackled like electricity before a storm. Officer Sullivan's raised hand hung suspended in the cool night air, but his attention had shifted to something else entirely. The unmistakable sound of confident footsteps approaching from behind him. The crowd of onlookers, phones still recording, collectively held their breath. "I wouldn't complete that motion if I were you, officer." The voice that spoke these words was calm, measured, and carried the kind of authority that comes from years of federal service. Officer Sullivan's raised hand began to waver. Standing firmly in place, the woman reached slowly into her blazer pocket and pulled out her phone, keeping her movements deliberate and visible to everyone watching. "I think it's time we documented this properly, don't you?" She started recording, her steady hands capturing every detail of the scene. The gathered crowd had grown larger now, forming a loose semicircle around the scene. Their phones created a wall of digital witnesses, their presence adding another layer of protection. A young woman in scrubs who had just finished her hospital shift spoke up from the crowd. "We've got it all on video, ma'am, every second since he pulled you over." Officer Sullivan's face began to shift from anger to uncertainty. His raised hand finally lowered, but the damage was already done. The threatening gesture had been captured by dozens of cameras, and the absence of his body camera's red recording light was painfully obvious to everyone present. "Turn around slowly, Officer Sullivan," came that authoritative voice again, closer now. "And while you're at it, perhaps you'd like to explain why your body camera is turned off during a traffic stop." The officer's complexion had taken on an ashen quality as he began to realize the gravity of his situation. He turned, ever so slowly, to face the source of that commanding voice. His eyes widened as they fell on the FBI credentials being held at chest level. "Good evening," the FBI agent said, his voice carrying clearly to the crowd of witnesses. "I'm a senior agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Would you care to explain why you were about to strike my wife during what should have been a routine traffic stop?" A whisper rippled through the crowd. Several people exchanged knowing looks. This wasn't going to end well for Officer Sullivan. The second police cruiser that had arrived earlier flashed its lights once, and two more officers stepped out, their expressions grave as they assessed the situation. I'm just... Officer Sullivan's voice trailed off as he struggled to find words that could justify his actions. The hand that had been raised in threat now hung limply at his side. "You were just what?" The FBI agent pressed, his voice remaining professional but carrying an edge of steel. "About to assault a civilian? A lawyer, no less. Over an allegedly broken taillight that we both know is functioning perfectly." The woman stepped forward, her phone still recording. For the record, Officer Sullivan never stated the actual reason for the traffic stop until after he ordered me out of the vehicle. He also failed to follow standard protocol by not identifying himself properly or stating the purpose of the stop when he first approached my vehicle. The FBI agent nodded, taking out his own phone and beginning to type notes. "That's interesting. And would you say his aggressive behavior began immediately upon approaching your vehicle?" "Yes," she replied clearly for the record. "His hostile attitude was apparent from the moment he got out of his patrol car. I have reason to believe I was targeted based on..." "Now wait just a minute." Officer Sullivan interrupted, his face flushing red again. "You can't prove." "Actually," came a voice from the crowd, "we can." A young man in a business suit stepped forward, his phone extended. "I started recording when I saw how aggressively he was walking toward her car. I've got everything from the moment he got out of his patrol car." More voices joined in from the crowd. "I've got it all too." "Same here, got the whole thing." "I already sent my video to the local news." Officer Sullivan's face had gone from red to pale again as he realized just how badly he had miscalculated. The two officers from the second patrol car were now walking toward the scene, their expressions professional but concerned. The FBI agent turned to them. "Officers, I believe we'll need to have a conversation about your colleague's conduct this evening. But first," he turned back to Officer Sullivan, his voice carrying the weight of years of federal law enforcement experience. "I think it's time we discussed the proper procedure for traffic stops, don't you? Starting with when it's appropriate to disable your body camera." The woman, still recording everything, allowed herself a small smile. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. This was about to become a teaching moment that would resonate through the entire department. But first, there were some immediate matters to address, starting with Officer Sullivan's clear abuse of power and ending with a complete review of the department's training procedures. The night air buzzed with the energy of impending change. Sometimes, the right people being in the wrong situation was exactly what was needed to spark real transformation. As she caught her husband's eye, they shared a look that said they both knew. This incident wouldn't be swept under the rug like so many others. This time would be different. The next hour unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of justice in action. The FBI agent took control of the scene with the quiet confidence that comes from years of handling high-pressure situations. He stood beside his wife, his presence both protective and professional as additional police vehicles arrived at the scene. The growing crowd of witnesses remained, their phones still recording, creating an undeniable public record of everything that followed. A light drizzle had started, but nobody moved. They'd all sensed they were watching something important unfold, a moment when the system actually worked the way it was supposed to. "Let's start with the basics," the FBI agent said, addressing the two officers who had arrived in the second patrol car. His voice was calm but carried unmistakable authority. "I want to file a formal complaint about Officer Sullivan's conduct. But first, I'd like to understand your department's policy on disabled body cameras during traffic stops." The senior of the two officers, a lieutenant with graying hair and tired eyes, stepped forward. "Body cameras are required to be active during all civilian interactions," he stated clearly, looking directly at Officer Sullivan. "Disabling them is a direct violation of department policy." Officer Sullivan shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado completely deflated. The hand he had raised in threat now fidgeted with his belt as he watched his career potentially unraveling before his eyes. The woman, still maintaining her professional composure, spoke up. "I'd like to provide my statement now while everything is fresh." She looked at her husband, then at the lieutenant. "And I believe these wonderful citizens have additional video evidence to share." The crowd murmured in agreement. A college student stepped forward, her phone already queued up to the beginning of the incident. "I've got clear footage of him approaching the car aggressively," she offered. "You can see his body camera light go off right before he reached the driver's window." More witnesses came forward, each with their own angle of the incident. A food delivery driver spoke up next. "I saw the whole thing from across the street. The way he walked up to her car, man, I knew something wasn't right. That's why I started recording." The FBI agent nodded appreciatively at each witness while typing notes on his phone. "Your civic responsibility here tonight is commendable," he said to the crowd. "Each of you saw something wrong and chose to document it rather than look away. That's how real change happens." He turned back to Officer Sullivan, who seemed to be shrinking inside his uniform. "Now, about that broken taillight you mentioned." The FBI agent walked calmly to the back of his wife's car. "Lieutenant, would you mind verifying the condition of these taillights?" The lieutenant walked over and inspected both taillights, which were clearly functioning perfectly. He shook his head slowly, disappointment evident in his expression. "Both taillights are in perfect working order, sir." "Well, that's interesting," the FBI agent continued, his voice level but pointed. "Because according to Officer Sullivan, this was the reason for the traffic stop. Would you agree this appears to be a case of racial profiling?" Officer Sullivan started to protest, but the lieutenant held up a hand, silencing him. "Given the circumstances and the evidence I've seen, I have to agree this looks like a clear violation of multiple department policies." The woman stepped forward again, her legal training evident in her precise language. "I'd like to formally request copies of all incident reports, including the initial reason logged for the traffic stop. As an attorney, I'm particularly interested in any documentation Officer Sullivan filed before approaching my vehicle." The growing discomfort on Officer Sullivan's face suggested there might not be any such documentation. The FBI agent noticed this too and made another note on his phone. "I'm also curious," he added, "about the department's training procedures regarding de-escalation and racial bias. Lieutenant, would you be willing to share those records as well?" The lieutenant nodded gravely. "Of course, sir." though I suspect this incident might lead to some significant updates to those procedures. The rain had picked up slightly, but the crowd remained, watching justice unfold in real time. This wasn't the usual script where power won over truth. Tonight was different. Tonight, accountability was taking center stage. A young mother in the crowd, holding an umbrella over her sleeping toddler, spoke softly to those around her. "My son's going to grow up in a world where this kind of thing gets handled the right way. That's what we're watching here, the right way." The FBI agent overheard her comment and turned to address the crowd. "What we're doing here tonight isn't just about one traffic stop or one officer. It's about setting the standard for how these situations should be handled. Every one of you who stayed to witness and document this, you're part of that change." His wife reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. They both knew this was just the beginning. The real work would start tomorrow: filing reports, following up on complaints, ensuring proper procedures were followed. But for now, they had shown everyone watching that the system could work when people stood up for what was right. The lieutenant was already on his radio, calling for Internal Affairs to respond to the scene. Officer Sullivan stood silently, watching as his actions from the last hour were about to become a teaching moment for police departments across the country. Sometimes, the biggest changes start with one person making the wrong choice and everyone else making the right ones. The next morning, the police station was buzzing with activity. The Internal Affairs Office had never seen such a thorough collection of evidence for a complaint. Dozens of videos from different angles, each showing the same disturbing scene of Officer Sullivan's misconduct, filled their screens. The FBI agent sat across from the Internal Affairs investigator, his wife beside him, as they reviewed the footage together. The investigator, a veteran officer with salt and pepper hair and reading glasses perched on her nose, shook her head as she watched. "In my 20 years on the force," she said, clicking through another video, "I've never seen such clear documentation of misconduct. The disabled body camera alone is a serious violation, but combined with everything else." The FBI agent nodded, pulling out a folder filled with properly formatted witness statements. "We have statements from 32 civilians who witnessed the incident. Each one corroborates my wife's account of the events." His wife, still as composed as she'd been during the traffic stop, added, "And I've prepared a detailed timeline of events, including Officer Sullivan's exact words and actions from the moment he activated his lights." The investigator picked up a thick report from her desk. "We've pulled Officer Sullivan's record. There's a pattern here that should have been noticed earlier." She spread out several complaint forms, each showing similar incidents of aggressive behavior during traffic stops. "The thing is," the investigator continued, removing her glasses, "none of these previous complaints had this level of evidence. Most were dismissed as she said situations." She looked directly at the couple. "You've given us what we needed to finally address this properly." Just then, there was a knock at the door. The police chief entered, his face serious but determined. "I've just finished reviewing all the footage," he said, taking a seat. "This isn't just about one officer anymore. We need to look at our entire system." The FBI agent leaned forward. "I have some suggestions about that, if you're willing to hear them." He pulled out another folder, this one containing training protocols from various police departments known for their successful community relations programs. "I've seen departments transform themselves," he explained. "It starts with acknowledging the problem and being willing to make real changes." He spread out several documents showing successful reform programs from other cities. The chief picked up one of the reports, studying it carefully. "These numbers are impressive. Community complaints down by 60% after implementing these changes." "Yes," the FBI agent confirmed, "and officer satisfaction up by 40%. When you do this right, everyone benefits." His wife added her legal perspective. "The key is creating a system of accountability that officers buy into. Not just punitive measures, but real training and support." The investigator was taking rapid notes. "We could start with mandatory body camera compliance training. Make it clear that disabled cameras are automatic grounds for suspension. And cultural sensitivity training," the chief added, surprising everyone with his enthusiasm. "Not just the basic stuff we do now, but real, in-depth programs. Partner with community leaders." The FBI agent smiled slightly. "I know some excellent trainers who specialize in police community relations. They're former officers themselves. They understand both sides of the equation. His wife opened her laptop, pulling up statistics she'd gathered overnight. Look at these numbers from cities that have implemented similar programs. Not only did complaints go down, but officer safety improved too. When communities trust their police, everyone's safer. The chief stood up and walked to a wall map of the city. We could pilot the program in this precinct, then roll it out citywide based on what we learn. The investigator was already drafting a preliminary report. I'll have the complete investigation of last night's incident done by tomorrow. But this broader initiative, this could really change things. Outside the office, they could hear the usual buzz of the police station, but something felt different. News of last night's incident had spread quickly through the force. Officers were gathered in small groups, discussing what had happened, sharing the viral videos, and, most importantly, talking about change. A young officer knocked and poked her head in. "Chief, some of us were wondering, could we sit in on the new training programs when they start? We want to be part of the solution." The chief smiled, genuinely this time. "That's exactly the attitude we need." He turned back to the group. "Maybe something good really can come from last night's incident." The FBI agent reached for his wife's hand under the table. They shared a look that said more than words could. What had started as a frightening traffic stop was transforming into something much bigger. A catalyst for real change in a system that desperately needed it. The investigator closed her notebook with a satisfying snap. "Well, let's get to work. Officer Sullivan's disciplinary hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning, but that's just the beginning. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." As they left the office that afternoon, they passed groups of officers engaged in serious discussions about community relations and proper procedure. Change was already in the air. Sometimes it takes one incident, captured at the right moment by the right people, to start a revolution in thinking. And that's exactly what was happening here. 1 week after the incident, the police department's largest conference room was packed to capacity. Officers, community leaders, and local media filled every seat, with more people standing along the walls. The air buzzed with anticipation as the police chief approached the podium. "What happened last week was a wake-up call," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "But today isn't about pointing fingers. It's about making real changes that will benefit everyone in our community." The FBI agent and his wife sat in the front row, surrounded by the witnesses who had recorded the incident. The young college student who had captured the first video was now sitting on a community advisory panel. The food delivery driver who had recorded from across the street was there too, ready to share his perspective on community police relations. The chief continued, clicking through a presentation that outlined the department's new initiatives. "Starting next week, we're implementing mandatory body camera compliance training. Any officer found to have deliberately disabled their camera will face immediate suspension pending investigation." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in approval. "Additionally," the chief went on, "we're launching a comprehensive cultural sensitivity training program. This isn't just about checking boxes. We're partnering with community leaders to create real understanding." The FBI agent's wife stood up next, walking to the podium as the chief stepped aside. As both a victim of profiling and a legal professional, her perspective carried special weight. "I could have filed a lawsuit," she began, looking around the room. "I could have pushed for Officer Sullivan to be fired immediately. But that wouldn't solve the underlying problems. What we need is systematic change." She clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from other cities that had implemented similar programs. "Look at these numbers. When police and communities work together, everyone wins. Crime rates go down. Officer safety improves. Trust builds." The young officer who had asked about training the week before raised her hand. "What about creating a regular forum where officers and community members can meet informally, just to talk and understand each other better?" The room buzzed with approval. The chief nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need. In fact, we're already planning monthly community dinners where officers and residents can share a meal and conversation." A senior officer stood up next. "I've been on the force for 20 years, and I'll be honest, I was skeptical at first. But after seeing those videos, after hearing the stories, we need this change, and I want to be part of it." The FBI agent then took his turn at the podium. Change isn't easy, he acknowledged, but it's necessary. I've worked with departments across the country, and I can tell you, the ones that embrace this kind of transformation become stronger, more effective, and more respected. He clicked to a new slide showing training schedules. We're not just talking about a few hours of sensitivity training. This is a complete overhaul of how we approach community policing. The delivery driver who had recorded the incident raised his hand. Will there be opportunities for civilians to participate in these training sessions, to share our experiences? Absolutely, the chief responded. In fact, we're creating a civilian advisory board that will have real input into our policies and procedures. Throughout the room, people were taking notes, nodding, and engaging in quiet discussions. This wasn't the usual bureaucratic meeting where changes were announced but never implemented. There was a sense of real commitment in the air. The wife spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience. What happened to me was traumatic, but it's also an opportunity. An opportunity to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. A community leader stood up. We've been asking for these changes for years. What makes this time different? The chief stepped forward. Because this time, we have undeniable evidence. We have a unified community demanding change. And most importantly, we have officers who want this change too. He gestured to the young officer who had suggested the community forum. Our newer officers especially understand that the old ways aren't working. They want to be part of a department they can be proud of. The FBI agent added, and you have federal support. We're not just providing guidance, we're offering resources, training materials, and ongoing assistance to make sure these changes stick. As the meeting continued, working groups were formed, combining officers, community leaders, and residents. Each group was assigned specific aspects of the new initiatives to develop and monitor. The woman who had faced Officer Sullivan's aggression watched it all with a mixture of hope and determination. What had started as a frightening traffic stop was transforming into real, measurable change. Sometimes, she realized, the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes. The chief closed the meeting with a powerful statement. This isn't just about policies and procedures. It's about changing hearts and minds. It's about building a department and a community where everyone feels safe, respected, and heard. As people filed out of the room, there was a sense of purpose in the air. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like genuine change was possible. 6 months after that fateful traffic stop, the local community center was alive with activity. The smell of home-cooked food filled the air as officers and residents shared meals at round tables, engaging in animated conversations. This was the 6th monthly community dinner, and the change in atmosphere was remarkable. The FBI agent's wife stood near the entrance, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. A young officer approached her, smiling warmly. "Remember when I gave you a ticket last month for that rolling stop?" the officer asked. "I do," she replied, returning the smile. "You were professional, respectful, and your body camera was definitely on." "The new training really works," the officer said. "But more than that, getting to know the community like this, it changes how you see things." The FBI agent joined them, carrying plates of food. "The numbers back that up," he said. "Complaints are down 70% since we implemented the new programs, and officer job satisfaction is at an all-time high." Across the room, the food delivery driver who had recorded the original incident was showing a group of rookie officers the best routes through neighborhood shortcuts. "This way's faster, and the residents know you're not just passing through to give tickets, you're there to help keep the area safe." The police chief walked in, accompanied by representatives from 3 other cities who had come to study their successful program. "It's becoming a model for departments across the country," he explained proudly. "What happened that night could have torn the community apart. Instead, it brought us together." Near the dessert table, the college student who had recorded the first video was now leading a youth outreach program. She was surrounded by teenagers, both residents and children of officers, all working together on community projects. "We're planning a basketball tournament next month," she announced excitedly. "Officers and residents mixed on the same teams. Plus, we're raising money for the new community center." The FBI agent's wife checked her phone, smiling at a notification. The state legislature just passed the new body camera law, she announced to those nearby. "The one we all worked on together. It goes into effect next month." The room burst into applause. This law, drafted with input from both law enforcement and community members, would ensure that what happened that night couldn't happen again, at least not without consequences. A senior officer who had initially been skeptical of the changes stood up to speak. "I've been on the force for 25 years, he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I knew everything about policing, but these past 6 months have taught me more than the previous 25 years combined." He gestured around the room. "Look at us, officers and residents sharing meals, planning events, solving problems together. This is what real community policing looks like." The chief nodded in agreement, and the results speak for themselves. Crime rates are down, response times are better, and most importantly, people trust us again. At a corner table, Officer Sullivan's former partner was speaking with community members. After the incident, he had become one of the strongest advocates for change. "We were doing it wrong for so long," he admitted. "We thought being tough was the answer. But building relationships, that's what really works." The FBI agent checked his own phone. "Just got word that 5 more departments are adopting our training program next month. This is spreading faster than we could have hoped." His wife squeezed his hand. "Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best changes," she said. That night could have been just another incident swept under the rug. Instead, it became a catalyst for real transformation. A local news crew was there, filming a follow-up story about the department's transformation. The reporter interviewed officers and residents alike, all sharing stories of positive changes they'd witnessed. 6 months ago, I would have been nervous to see a police car in my rearview mirror, one resident told the camera. Now I'm more likely to wave and say hello to the officer. That's what real change looks like. The young officer who had suggested the community forums in the first meeting was now leading the department's community outreach division. "We're not just enforcing laws anymore," she explained to the reporter. "We're building relationships, solving problems together, becoming part of the community we serve." As the evening wound down, the FBI agent and his wife prepared to leave. They looked around the room one last time, taking in the scene of officers and residents chatting, laughing, and making plans for future events. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "that traffic stop was terrifying. But look what came from it. Real change, real progress." Her husband nodded. "Sometimes it takes one moment, one incident, to spark a revolution. But it's what people do with that spark that matters." They walked out into the cool evening air, passing a newly installed sign that read, "Community and Police, working together for a safer tomorrow." It wasn't just a slogan anymore, it was reality. The incident that could have been another tragic headline had instead become a story of transformation, proof that change was possible when people came together with genuine determination to make things better. As they drove home, they passed a police car, and the officer waved warmly. Times had truly changed.